The streets below, Dornstall landed with a splash, the putrid slime of the sewer rising up to the tops of his boots. The stench hit immediately, old decay, promethium runoff, and something worse. Ahead and behind, Grimness guardsmen were already taking position, weapons trained up and down the tunnel, their heavy coats stained from the descent. Lumen strips cast a pale, greenish glow, turning every brick into a whispering ghost. To one side, Hyorowolf stood quietly, helm turned, auspex in hand, its screen flickering uselessly. Alpha Braylon dropped beside Dornstall, landing hard and steady. She said nothing, just took up position at his side with a nod. Tunbald was next, descending with practiced ease. Cuthelm came last, his force stave held low to avoid catching on the ancient pipework arching overhead. Tunbald's bolter, marked by its snarling warghead muzzle, was already raised. Hyorowolf clicked off the auspex and slotted it back into his belt. "Useless down here," he said. "Too much interference." Dornstall adjusted the seals of his gas mask, voice muffled through the respirator. Trinova's built on heavy mineral beds in the bones of the founding colony, and the river Talmud runs just overhead. Hyorowolf gave a short nod of understanding. "Sanctum Medicae Trinova?" "This way," Dornstall replied, and without waiting, led them into the gloom. The group moved in near silence, the only sounds the wet squelch of boots through the fetid runoff and the occasional hiss of Dornstall's rebreather. The Trinova sewers had not been built. They had been layered over centuries. Old colony sublevels, rusted aqueducts, vaults from ages no longer on record. It smelled of forgotten time and something else, something fresher, wronger. The Grimness sappers stayed close, their lasguns up, sweeping corners as they passed half-collapsed grates and rotting industrial pipes. The lumen strips cast long shadows that twitched with every movement, creating the illusion of figures that weren't there. Every sound echoed. A drip behind them became footsteps. A gust of air became a breath on the neck. Somewhere far off, a metallic clatter, as though something had been dropped or dragged. The humans were tense. Even Braylon kept one hand on her Sepinta and another near her combat knife. The guardsmen murmured prayers under their breath. Dornstall tried not to look behind him. The Astartes, by contrast, walked in silence. Heavy, confident, inevitable. Hyorowolf moved like a war sculpture come to life, every motion deliberate. Tunbald stalked beside him like a hunting beast, bolter low but ready. Cuthelm walked a pace behind, power stave faintly humming. His eyes were distant. "I feel something," he murmured. Braylon turned slightly. "What kind of something?" Cuthelm frowned. "Nothing I can name. No warp presence, no minds to touch, just noise. Something is bleeding through." He paused, then added, "But it hides. It's still." They pressed on. After another 2 turns, they found him. The body lay against a rusted bulkhead door, one arm outstretched as if reaching toward the control panel. Fraterus Templar. His white armor was stained brown with blood and filth. His chest plate was caved in, helmet cracked. Around him were 3 dead infected, twisted bodies, their limbs wrong, jaws split too wide. One of them had been shot through the skull. Another had its torso ripped open by sheer force. The third had a broken neck, bent back at an unnatural angle, likely done by hand. Hyorowolf crouched, inspecting the fallen warrior with care, gloved hand brushing over the black aquila painted on the ruined breastplate. "He died standing," the captain said. Cuthelm looked around the corridor walls, seeing claw marks and dried ichor smeared across the bricks. He gave a faint nod. 3 with him, and he killed them all. Braylon leaned in, retrieving a still functional power cell from the fallen Templar's belt and handing it to one of the Grimness troopers. She said, "At least we know we're going the right way." Dornstall exhaled. "Let's just hope we're not too late." They pressed deeper into the gloom, the walls narrowing, the air growing heavy, not just with scent, but with weight, like the passage itself resisted their advance. Dornstall glanced back. "We're close to the lower coolant thoroughfare. The old secondary reactor lines run beneath it." Ahead, 2 of the Grimness sappers took point. Last carbines held ready, moving with caution through the arched corridor. Then, without warning, both staggered. "Shh!" one gasped, dropping his weapon. The other made a strangled sound, clutching at his mask. A moment later, both collapsed, convulsing, their breathers hissing as the filters bubbled and melted from the inside out. Their skin blistered where exposed. One clawed at his throat, the other didn't move at all. Poison, Dornstall shouted. Hierowolf was already moving. In a blur of speed unnatural for something so massive, he surged forward, grabbing both men under one arm each and hauling them bodily backward, retreating a dozen meters before stopping. Steam and greenish vapor curled around his legs as he stepped free of the miasma. He dropped to one knee, checking them. One was gone. The other wheezed, lungs rattling. He looked up grimly. Their rebreathers are not rated for this. He tapped the sealed vents of his helm. Mine is. Yours are not. They turned to look back. The vapor was slowly curling forward, dense, caustic, creeping along the floor like a living thing. The bricks nearest the source were hissing, melting, the mortar running like wax. Beyond the gas, slumped against a column just inside the haze, they saw the blackened remains of an Arbite's constable. His chest plate had split open. His Vox unit had melted into the stone. Cuthelm stepped forward, stave ready, but stopped short as his Auspex rune flickered yellow with warning. Even the warp is silent in that cloud, he muttered. Braylon frowned. There's no way to hold our seals that tight, not for that distance. Hierowolf stood, setting the fallen guardsman gently down. Then we find another path. This one's lost. The others nodded grimly. Dornstall checked his slate, consulting hand-drawn additions from the smuggler case years before. There's a runoff tunnel 2 levels down. We'll have to descend through a dry turbine shaft and come back up. Hierowolf nodded once. Lead on. Behind them, the surviving guardsman began binding the face of his unconscious comrade, whispering the litany of survival. And the toxic cloud hissed behind them, waiting. The dry turbine shaft loomed before them, a massive rust-ringed cylinder descending into shadow. Once it had roared with the scream of steam and motion, but now only dust and time moved here. Steel rungs lined one side, half-rusted, slick with condensation. Braylon scanned downward with her scope lumen, the light disappearing into darkness. Tombald clicked a fresh mag into his warg-headed bolter. I'll take point. They descended one by one. About a third of the way down, Tombald paused. Contact. They froze. Below him, set awkwardly on a narrow maintenance ledge, lay a Templar's bolter, its casing etched with golden Aquila filigree. The barrel was caked in blood. Next to it, half submerged in grime, was a ruptured Arbit's carapace plate, still bearing a Trinova precinct sigil. No bodies. Farther below, the turbine blade assembly yawned out of the dark like a row of ancient teeth. The great fins now still, their edges corroded, webbed with old fungal rot. Scattered around the base were the bodies of infected. 5, maybe 6. Their twisted forms were riddled with bolt holes and lasburns, arms frozen mid-reach. One had its head caved in by blunt force. Another had its own claw driven through its skull, likely turned on itself in death spasms. Cuthelm crouched beside the corpses. They were killed quickly, no time to turn, clean fight. Dornstall found a discarded Vox unit, still warm, not long ago. Hierowolf retrieved the Templar bolter and checked its readout. 8 rounds remaining. Braylon stepped forward, hand on the wall. No bodies of ours, Templar or Arbite, that's the problem. The shaft ended on a catwalk, overlooking a secondary chamber. As they crossed, the architecture changed. Stone replacing steel. The air became dry, colder. They passed beneath a rusted arch and entered a vaulted hall, far older than the hive levels above. The floor was cobbled, laid centuries before by forgotten hands. The walls, high and curved, had once housed windows, now bricked in, with their outlines still visible in the mortar. The light of their shoulder lumens cut through the stagnant dark as they passed beneath another brick arch. The vaulted hall they walked through had once been a wide avenue, now swallowed by layers of history and neglect. Dornstall ran a hand along the blackened bricks, voice low and steady. These are the original streets of Trinova, the first level. The city's been built and rebuilt over millennia. Roads become basements, habs become foundations. You pile a hive high enough, the bottom rots and no one looks down again. They passed an old wrought iron sign, half melted, its Gothic script still faintly legible, Valen-marked row. He gestured back toward the rusted turbine chamber. That old system was for drainage, used to flush seawater and runoff during high tides, back when this planet had tides. This street, it would have bustled once. Market carts, cog trams, workers. Now it's just another part of the underhive. He paused, sweeping his light across a walled-off intersection where a crude barrier of Instacrete sealed the road beyond. That one led to the Great Valleys sector. But after the last food riot, Sensorac Centauri had the connecting streets flooded with resincrete. Anything down here is locked in with us. It can't spread. Braylon slowed, eyes scanning the aged architecture, and the signs of life long extinguished. She gestured to a collapsed doorway where a broken cot and rusted cook stove sat in eerie stillness. People live in other undersectors, don't they? Why not here? This could be used as storage, even industry. Why abandon it? Her voice was thick with quiet anger, born of NihtWyrtha, where every brick was used, every soul had purpose. Dornstall's reply came slowly. Expediency. The underhive doesn't exist, not officially, so it doesn't pull resources, doesn't get air, water, protection. People down here, they're just left to rot. They walked in silence for a moment, boots tapping on ancient cobble. Hjorwolf broke the quiet. It's not unusual. Most hives end up like this. My mother, he paused briefly, then continued. She always said NihtWyrtha must never forget the bottom of the tower. The base holds the weight. Lose that, and everything falls. Braylon lowered her gaze, absent-mindedly, or perhaps not. Her hand drifted down, resting over her armor where her abdomen curved beneath it. I wouldn't want my child to grow up on a world like this. There was a hush. Cuthhelm at the rear walked a pace closer, his voice quiet, with no mockery. He won't. He'll grow up in a grand hall. Braylon glanced sharply over her shoulder. Cuthhelm froze, realizing what he'd just said. The others looked to him, startled. He looked down, abashed, adjusting his grip on the force stave. Braylon said nothing, only turned forward again, expression unreadable, her hand not leaving her belly. They continued forward, their footfalls echoing down the ghost road, the city of the dead watching in silence. The group moved cautiously along the old cobbled street, their boots crunching over grit and loose masonry. The overhead conduits groaned softly with age, exhaling warm vapor from unseen fractures, and above them the newer city, Trinova proper, rested like a weight on the back of a forgotten corpse. They turned at a broken iron signpost, its lettering long since corroded to illegibility, and came upon the rusting hulk of a tram. It sat skewed on twisted rails, half swallowed by dust and debris, its glass long shattered and its frame bloated with corrosion. An ancient municipal number still clung to its side, but was faded beyond reading. Scattered across the ground were the marks of a desperate struggle, spent bolt shells, the curled husks of las cartridges, a snapped auto-injector. Blood, dried and flaked like rust, was sprayed across the side of the tram, but it was the interior that caught their breath. Inside, someone had tried to make a last stand, or perhaps a last hospital. Stretcher braces were folded out and stained, medical packs lay torn open, a dermal knit applicator fused to the wall by heat. There were bodies, too, slumped in the corners, gray-skinned, atrophied, fingers twisted into needles. Infected. But there were no defenders, no gear, no bones. Just a gurney that bore the scorch marks of a plasma wound. Someone tried to hold here, Braylon murmured, stepping past a broken medi-servitor that had fused into the bulkhead like melted wax. They pressed on, taking the sloping road downward. With each step the mist grew thicker, and the walls closer, as the undercity consumed them once more. Concrete gave way to rusted stonework, newer construction layered awkwardly over the older. At last, set into a hollow at the foot of the road, they found it. The old entrance to the Grand Sanctum Medicae Trinova. A half-shattered fountain stood before it, its cherubic statue long defaced, basin dry and choked with rubble. The building's facade was bricked in haphazardly, some windows sealed with plasteel, others crudely mortared over. A set of reinforced blast doors had once replaced the main archway, now twisted back on its hinges from a recent explosion, smoke-stained and still warm to the touch. They entered with weapons drawn. Inside, the darkness swallowed them. Only the faint hiss of venting pressure and the dripping of unknown fluids echoed ahead. Dornstall paused at the cracked plinth that once bore the Medicae's sigil, now blackened by age and ash. "We're still too high," he said, checking the depth gauge on his auspex. "The reactors will be 2 levels below this. What was once the basement, original infrastructure, pre-Gothic expansion." Hjorwolf turned to the sappers. "Defensive position here," he ordered. "No one in or out. When we come back up, it'll be fast. Any blast we cause down there will reach this point right before us. When you hear it, fall back to the tram." The men acknowledged with curt nods and went to work, dragging crates, cabling stubbers, unspooling motion trip lines across the hall's choke points. One leaned over the broken fountain, inserting vox beads into place. Hjorwulf turned back to the others. "Let's move." The three Astartes, Braylon, and Dornstall pushed onward, down a cracked flight of stairs ending abruptly in poured concrete. Roof above, floor below, no way through. The primary access shaft had been sealed during one of the purges. Instead, they turned through a maintenance corridor into a narrower, steeper service stair. The metal mesh treads rang beneath them, dust coated every surface, except the prints. Several overlapping footfalls had disturbed the layers in places, some small, some larger. "Recent," Braylon whispered, one finger on the smudged treads. The descent led them into a deeper sublevel. The temperature dropped noticeably, their breath visible now in faint puffs of white. Frost crawled over pressure valves and cold piping along the ceiling. The lumen strips above were dead, flickering faintly with static charge. They emerged into a long, half-lit corridor. The walls bore signs of newer work, smoother stone, steel bracing, and signs of occasional upkeep. One door had been forced open, the locking bolts plasma-scored and twisted. Beyond it, silence. They stepped through into the mortuary. Vast cold storage units lined the flanking walls, recessed behind thick translucent plates. Dim lumen rods ran along the base, pulsing in a slow, sterile rhythm. The cold here was near biting. Even the Astartes slowed slightly, servos stiffening in the joints. Each unit was numbered. Some had internal frost, obscuring the contents. Others were vacant or empty. A few were broken open. Scrapes marked the floor, something dragged. Blood had frozen into tar-like streaks that stopped at a drainage grate. Tools lay on a tray nearby, still clean. Dornstall leaned closer to one of the morgue chambers, his expression tightening. "It's empty," he said, stepping back warily. Tunbald, his weapon trained down the dim passageway, didn't look away. "With all this carnage, you'd think they'd need every slot filled." Alpha Braylon moved deeper into the cold chamber. Scattered sheets lay curled like dried skin on the floor, and unspeakable smears of fluid painted the tiles. She stooped, retrieving a pair of optic aids, then a denomination packet used for the last rites. "I think it was recently occupied," she said, voice low. Cuthelm snorted. "Typical. Plague outbreak, and the servitors still follow protocols. Clear the bodies, make room for more." Dornstall frowned, gaze drifting. He was a constable, not an investigator, but it didn't take a detective's mind to see what had happened. "Taken them where?" he asked, voice sharp. "Roads are closed, the city above's ablaze. You see any corpse carts?" He knelt, lifting a torn scrap of Trinova constable's uniform, then let it fall. His eyes locked on the floor. Footprints. Dozens. Hundreds. Slick trails in blood and slime leading out of the morgue room, not into it. His mouth drew into a grim line. "And I don't think the dead walk all that often, except in picked films." "Reanimation of necrotic flesh," Cuthelm stated dryly. They turned their lights downward now, casting wide cones across the stained floors. From the corners of every mortuary hold, more tracks revealed themselves. Thousands, pressed into congealed fluids and faded boot wax, all leading in one direction down the corridor. Braylon broke the silence, her voice a rasp. "You can't reanimate necrotic flesh." Tunbald tilted his head and behind his helm made a grimace. "Technically, it's not necrotic, cold storage. Some retain stasis, not decomposition, suspended viability. If the infection preserves motor function after clinical death, it could happen." They all turned toward him. It was more words than he'd spoken since the Orc War. Tunbald shrugged slightly. "On NihtWyrtha, when a sailor falls into the sea, if the water is cold enough, you can bring him back hours later. This is a darker version of that. And with the demonic nature of the Trinovian malady." He trailed off, letting the implications hang. Cuthelm gave Hjorwulf a sideways glance and chuckled. "You know Wulfgar called them Draugr," Hjorwulf grunted, "and we're revenants." Dornstall looked over. "What's a revenant anyway? Some sort of predator creature from your homeworld?" Alpha Braylon allowed herself a short laugh. "In Wirthan, revenant means undead." Dornstall blinked, looking from one towering Astartes to the next, their blue armor marked by ghost skull emblems, their presence cold as the crypt around them. You named yourselves the Space Undead? He shook his head, and I thought Grimness was a strange place. Hjorwolf stepped past them, boots following the bloodied trail. Come on, let's see where the dead are walking. They followed the corridor in silence, weapons raised. The trail of footfalls had become a flood. Thousands of overlapping prints pressed into the grime and dried viscera. The passage opened onto a broad, sloped accessway, rising at an incline toward the Sanctum Medicae Trinova proper. Along the edges, faint drag marks and broken handrails bore testament to a mass movement, an exodus of the dead. Here and there, bodies had fallen, crushed beneath the tide. What remained were pulped torsos, shattered ribs, fragments of skull ground into the grit. Toonbald, sweeping his weapon across the slope, said, "Just off the top of your heads, how many bodies does the Medicae hold in its mortuary?" Dornstall answered instinctively, without turning. "All bodies go to the nutrient plant eventually. Sanctum Medicae Trinova is the hub. It processes the dead from every hospital in the city." He slowed slightly, his expression tightening. "They bulk transfer them to the flesh-rendering centers once a month." Hjorwolf glanced back, voice flat. "How many?" Dornstall hesitated. "On a normal month, ignoring the malady, more than 100,000. There was a silence. "And this is just the lower mortuary," he added quietly. Hjorwolf stopped, fixing him with a look. "You're only mentioning this now?" Dornstall pulled out a small flask and took a long drink. "Corpses aren't the Arbides' business. If it's not a crime, we don't ask questions. The dead didn't get up and walk off before, so it never really mattered." Without replying, Hjorwolf continued upward, cresting the slope. The shattered blast door ahead bore a faded warning. Reactor housing. No admittance without authorization. It had been blown inward, the edges blackened, control panels melted. Inside, the air was still, but carried the coppery sting of ozone and something fouler. The lighting was irregular, flickering in intervals as if trying to warn them away. Hjorwolf knelt, running his fingers through the grime at the entrance. "Footfalls here too," he said. "Deep ones, worn smooth. Something heavy passed through." They passed through the ruined archway into the reactor section, their boots crunching over grit and spent shell casings. A small guard post stood just within. Its steel shutters had been left halfway down, one bent back by force. Inside, the remains of 2 station guards slumped in unnatural repose. One had a las pistol in hand, a hole neatly bored through the side of his skull, dried black blood painting the wall behind him. The other had not been so lucky. His body was torn open, ribs splayed like petals, his entrails flung across the control console. "Caught early," Dornstall said, eyes hard. "Didn't even get a warning out." They moved past the post and into the reactor hall itself. The space was vast, well-maintained, clinical in design. Red flooring marked safety lanes in contrast to the gray, power-armored walls. Lumen strips buzzed overhead, some functioning, others flickering, leaving whole sections cloaked in flickering gloom. Ahead, they saw the bodies, dozens. Infected corpses sprawled in heaps, limbs twisted, mouths still frozen in snarls. Among them, fallen warriors clad in crimson and gold, Fraterist Templars, and one in city gray, a constable, her body collapsed over a medical kit, blood still fresh beneath her. A final stand had been made here. "They tried to hold the corridor," said Braylon quietly, stepping over a dropped autogun. "Didn't last long." They advanced through the field of the dead, toward the core of the hall, where the primary reactor manifold loomed like a slumbering behemoth. And there, slumped against the curved housing, sat a figure in battered power armor, one hand still gripping a shattered detonator. Marshal Henrik Voss. His armor bore the marks of battle, clawed rents, burn scars, the shattering of a gorget plate. Around him, more Fraterus lay. Some showed signs of gunfire, others of something more terrible. Bloating, warping, distorted flesh. They had turned. Voss had resisted, but now he looked up at their approach, eyes flickering with unnatural green light. His face was pale, soaked in sweat. Black welts and sigils bubbled across his flesh, glowing faintly beneath the skin. He was infected, corrupted, but not fallen, because he had chained himself to the manifold. Thick iron cuffs locked his wrist to a coolant pipe. In his free hand, the detonator pack sparked uselessly, wires torn, the ignition node bitten through, teeth marks visible in the copper. Hjorwolf stepped closer, sword still sheathed. "Marshal," Voss coughed, a fleck of blood spraying his chest plate. Didn't turn, he rasped. Not yet, not fully. He pulled on the chain slightly. Couldn't risk it. Toonbald knelt beside the charge, his fingers running over the casing. This isn't standard demolition, he said after a moment. Void stable, non-volatile. He tapped the shattered trigger. Needs a high-heat microigniter. Charge is intact, but inert. Can you fix it? Harrowolf asked. Toonbald shook his head. Not with what we have. This type of charge, deliberately safe. Used for boarding torpedoes and reactor scuttles. Needs specialist fusing to go off. And this one's been chewed. Marshal Voss laughed weakly. It was a broken sound. Figures. Harrowolf approached slowly, eyes meeting the marshal's. You held your post. Voss nodded once. They turned. The others, I didn't. He lifted his head, green eyes blazing faintly through the sickness. You'll need to finish this for the city. Hjorwolf looked at the others. Hjorwolf turned to Cuthhelm. Can you summon a charge to detonate this? The librarian shook his head, grim-faced. I am only a Lexicanian, an epistolary, perhaps. But even if I could, the forces involved could rupture the veil, a breach in the immaterium. His tone made it clear. The risk was absolute. Hjorwolf turned next to Toonbald, who was already holding a plasma grenade, inspecting it. Even this, he said, isn't enough. Maybe if we pooled every charge we had, but with no fuse, it would take us with it. Braylon stepped away, scanning the pipes leading into the walls. Could we just sever the coolant feeds? Force it into overload? Dornstall shook his head and pulled out his flask again. We tried that a year ago. Did a safety inspection down here. He knocked his knuckles on the wall. Clank. If the coolant system is breached, the reactor scrams, shuts itself down. Cogitators are welded inside the walls for security. No access. From the base of the manifold, Marshal Voss gave a low, dry chuckle. His voice was cracking now, green-glazed eyes dull but aware. Sorry I was so efficient, he rasped. They looked to him as he coughed again, thick fluid bubbling at the corners of his mouth. We did consider igniting the promethium cells, he said weakly, nodding toward the wall-mounted tubes glowing a sickly green in the lumen gloom. But you'd have to hit them all at once. They're case-hardened, no way to cause a chain reaction. Horrorwolf frowned. Why do you even have promethium tanks? Voss gave the hint of a smile. To burn clothing and non-reductible body parts. This is a sanctum medicae. The tanks feed the crematorium, 2 levels up. It made sense. Everything dangerous had been stored down here, heavily shielded, armored, every precaution taken, every safety in place, the kind of place designed to never go wrong, and thus impossible to destroy. Hjorwolf felt the bitterness rise in him, the Revenant's first true battle, and all it would be remembered for was the lack of a single detonator. No heroics, no final victory, just entrapment in a cold tomb filled with corpses. Voss's voice broke the silence. Constable Dornstall. Dornstall turned. Tell Winthrop, I did my best, Voss said. His words were slurred, skin gray and slick with sweat. The burden of duty is his now. He coughed again, deeper this time. And one more thing, he added softly. Don't let me come back as one of them. Dornstall looked at Braylon, who nodded once. He stood beside the marshal, drawing his sidearm without a word. The weight of duty, understood in silence. But before he raised the weapon, he paused. Then, almost gently, he unscrewed the flask and handed it to Voss. The marshal smiled as he took it, suppressing another cough. Thank you, he whispered, raising it to his lips with a trembling hand. Hjorwolf looked around the chamber, his mind racing, trying to piece together something. He wasn't made for this. Not like Bjornwolf, who could see threads in chaos. Not like Adric, who could untangle a battlefield with a single glance. He was a weapon, a dart loosed from a sling, not a strategist. And yet, a thought struck. Slow, incomplete, but real. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. I think, he said aloud, eyes narrowing with intent. I have an idea. Hjorwolf placed his helm back onto his head with a hiss of pressure, locking the seals tight. He moved Dornstall's pistol gently aside. The Void Revenants ask one last duty of you, Marshal, he said. Marshal Voss looked up from where he was slumped, his eyes glowing faintly. Name it. Hjorwolf turned to Cuthhelm and Toonbald. Pull those tanks off the wall. Place them around the reactor control cores and cogitator banks. If Dornstall remembers where they're hidden. Dornstall nodded grimly, holstering his weapon. I remember. He crossed the room, gesturing to the armored panels embedded into the walls. Hjorwolf knelt beside the marshal, tugging at the chain that bound him to the pipe. He fixed the plasma grenade to the pipe's surface, tying it securely. Then he hooked the other end of the chain onto the marshal's belt. He met Voss's glowing eyes. "Hold on as long as you can. The infection will finish what we can't." Voss nodded slowly, understanding. With effort, he pushed himself upright and raised his free hand in a salute. The tanks were set in place, half-ruptured barrels of thick promethium, rigged beside junctions and machinery. Hjorwolf looked to Cuthelm. "Crush the tanks!" Cuthelm raised one gauntlet. A force rippled through the air, and each tank buckled inward with a shriek of metal. Thick, chemical-smelling promethium gushed from their ruptures, pooling on the floor and under the cogitators. Hjorwolf turned back to Voss one last time. The marshal gave him a final salute, straight-backed, defiant in his corruption. Hjorwolf returned it without a word. Then he turned and walked away, Braylin and Cuthelm falling in behind him. Dornstall lingered for a heartbeat, then saluted. "For what it's worth, Marshal, you did good." He turned and followed the others. Tumbald remained a moment longer. He stood in the growing fumes, watching the fuel ripple across the tiles. Then, solemnly, he touched 2 fingers to his breastplate and dragged them across, the highest sign of respect a Wigathan warrior could give another. Vos gave him the faintest nod, his expression resolute. Tumbald stepped out of the chamber and helped the others brace the doors. They sealed the blast hatch as best they could. No sooner had they turned than the sound of movement echoed down the corridor. An infected figure stumbled down the incline ahead, half dragging a twisted leg. Without thinking, Tumbald raised his bolter and fired. A single shot. The creature's skull exploded, and the corpse tumbled down the steps with a dull thud. Then came the sound. From above. The roar. The thunder of feet. A rising, swelling mass of noise. Hjorwolf's voice cut through it like steel. "Run!" Tumbald cursed himself and stood his ground. He raised his bolter and fired, 10 precise rounds. The first wave of infected fell in a staggered heap, limbs twitching, heads burst like fruit. The second wave stumbled over them, slowing for only a breath. Then he turned and ran. Hjorwolf was ahead, cloak trailing, helm glinting in the flickering light. Alpha Braylin sprinted just behind him, her coat flaring with each stride. Cuthelm and Dornstall were side by side, Dornstall huffing, Cuthelm laughing breathlessly. "I assumed becoming a post-human meant more shooting and driving tanks," Cuthelm yelled, not at anyone in particular. "I could have gotten the running back in the Wigathan." Behind them, Tumbald skidded to a halt again, spun, and fired 10 more rounds, felling the closest pursuers. Then he ran. Outside, at the threshold of the understreet exit, a Grimness guardsman crouched beside 3 infected corpses, confused, trying to determine how they'd made it this far up. He didn't get to finish the thought. Alpha Braylin burst through the doorway in a rush, her voice sharp and urgent. "Run! Now!" The sappers didn't hesitate. They scattered, sprinting toward the rusting carcass of the old tram resting on its rails like a sleeping beast. Behind her, Hjorwolf stood in the blasted doorway. He let Dornstall and Cuthelm sprint past him, then fired a single bolt round down the corridor. The shot cracked like thunder, and the muzzle flash lit Tumbald as he sprinted up from the dark. Then they ran together. Below, in the failing light of the reactor room, Marshal Henrik Vos heard the pounding. It was dull at first, distant but rising fast. The crash of metal, the thunder of feet. He blinked slowly. Promethium lapped at his boots, sloshing cold and thick. He looked down, then up. They were here. The infected poured through the breach in the doors, but slowed as they approached. They formed a ring around him, watching. In their mangled minds, something in him was familiar. Corruption recognized its kin. He was no longer prey. Marshal Voss tried to stand tall, but pain ripped through his spine as something burst from his back, a third appendage, like a stinger, whipping and pulsing with unnatural rhythm. His vision wavered. "Still, for Trinova," he whispered. And then Marshal Voss died. What remained opened its eyes. It could sense the fleeting warmth of the uninfected above. It longed to share the song, to embrace, to spread. With a snarl, it took one step forward, and the plasma charge, rigged, soaked, and surrounded by volatile fuel, detonated. The reactor hall vanished in a flash of fire and light. In the Undercity, Braylon heard the rush of air before she felt the heat. Her eyes widened. Tram! She dove through the broken window of the abandoned conveyance, dragging herself behind rusted seating. The Grimness sappers tumbled in after her, slamming into steel and flooring. A rumble followed. Dornstall and Cuthelm leapt into the tram's main door just as the corridor behind them filled with light. Braylon looked back, saw the fireball rolling up the street, and ducked down. Toonbald and Heorwulf threw themselves inside. The blast wave hit a second later, engulfing the street. The barricade at the riverbank shook under the weight of the dead. The river itself had vanished beneath a crawling carpet of infected, bodies surging over one another, splashing, howling, dragging themselves up the shattered stone banks like a tide of rot. Atop the bluff, Elfric stood bareheaded, hands raised. His breath misted in the air, eyes glowing with stormlight. Each movement of his hands cast arcs of force into the swarm, crushing, breaking, burning the abominations crawling over the battered hull of a ruined Leman Russ. The old tank's hull hissed where claws scraped across its plating, and the gunner atop it, face blackened with soot, pumped round after round from an autogun into the seething horde. But they were breaking through. On the half-ruined bridge at the center of the line, Wulfgar fought with fire in his blood. He wrenched Phyrexian from the wreckage of a burning chimera, dragging the wounded constable through the smoke as a god chain of infected servitors tore into the tank's side, buzzsaws whirring, augmetic limbs raking through ceramite. Wulfgar turned, one hand dragging his chainsword free, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the men of Grimness's guard, a bloodied banner drooping behind them. The last constables stood among them, forming a ragged firing line, bolters and stubbers raised. Behind them, the bridge groaned, sagging under the weight of so many bodies. "For the Emperor!" Wulfgar roared, raising his blade high. "For Grimness!" came the shout from the guardsmen. "Trinova stands!" bellowed Winthrop from atop the sandbag line, his cap long gone, uniform burned, eyes defiant. And then, the Sanctum Medicae Trinova detonated. A blinding pulse of blue-white plasma split the skyline, washing the city in a flash of light so intense that shadows burned into the stone. The blast erupted upward and outward, shattering windows miles away, flinging masonry high into the air like shrapnel. A great slab of sanctum wall spun end over end before crashing into the river with a wave of boiling steam. Plasma fire rolled in sheets, pouring into the river in a storm front of glowing death. The infected in its path were instantly vaporized, turned to ash and seared bone, their screams lost beneath the thunder of ruin. The shockwave blew out across the lower city, toppling buildings, caving in ferrocrete lanes, shattering the bridge beneath Wulfgar's boots. Yet somehow he stood. The blast died away, leaving a burning crater where the sanctum had been. Smoke curled into the crimson sky. Wulfgar stood among the survivors, steam rising from his armor, a long rent down one greave. Phyrexian lay breathing beside him, barely conscious. The guardsmen around him, a mere handful now, lowered their weapons. Sergeant Winthrop limped forward through the drifting cinders. He held out his flask. Wulfgar took it with a grim smile, opened it, and drank deep. Winthrop laughed, hoarse and bitter. "Like old times, eh?" Wulfgar coughed, wiped blood from his chin, and nodded. "Aye, just fewer of us left to laugh." They stood in silence a moment longer, looking out over the burning river.